telegram arrived on a bitter December morning in 1894, its urgent words cutting through the comfortable warmth of our Baker Street lodgings like a Highland dirk through velvet. I had been engrossed in the morning papers, reading with growing concern of the unprecedented snowstorms that had been battering the Scottish Highlands for the past fortnight, when Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread upon the stairs announced the arrival of what would prove to be one of our most challenging and perilous cases. "A wire for Mr. Holmes," she announced, her breath visible in the chill air that seemed to permeate even our well-heated rooms that morning. The boy said it came from Scotland and marked most urgent. Holmes, who had been standing at the window in his purple dressing gown, examining through his magnifying glass what appeared to be traces of tobacco ash from his latest monograph, turned with that peculiar alertness that always preceded our most intriguing adventures. "Scotland, you say?" He took the yellow envelope with those long, sensitive fingers that had so often been the instruments of justice. "And urgent, naturally. When is a summons to the Highlands ever otherwise?" He tore open the telegram with characteristic precision and read its contents twice before speaking. I observed the familiar tightening around his grey eyes that indicated a problem of more than ordinary interest. "Watson, how quickly can you pack for an extended stay in what I suspect will be most inhospitable conditions? We are summoned to the assistance of one Dr. Margaret Sinclair, Dean of Geological Studies at Edinburgh University. It appears that a rather distinguished gathering of academics has found itself in considerable distress." "What sort of distress?" I inquired, already rising to prepare for what experience had taught me would likely be an immediate departure. "A death, my dear fellow, and under circumstances that the good Dr. Sinclair describes as most peculiar and deeply troubling. The victim is one Professor Alistair McKenna, apparently discovered at dawn near a cliff face, his body half buried in snow. The authorities have been summoned, but cannot reach the location due to the storms. Hence our involvement." I felt the familiar stirring of anticipation that accompanied the beginning of our investigations. Where precisely are we bound? Cairngorm Lodge, situated in what Dr. Sinclair describes as splendid isolation, some 15 miles northeast of Braemar. The party consists of 6 academics and their students attending what was meant to be a week-long geological symposium. They have now been trapped there for 3 days by the worst Highland storms in living memory. Holmes moved with that swift efficiency I knew so well, gathering his traveling clothes and essential items. "The train for Edinburgh leaves at noon. We shall need to make arrangements for transport north from there, though I suspect the final portion of our journey may prove somewhat arduous." As I packed my medical bag alongside my warmest clothing, I could not suppress a slight shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. There was something in Holmes's tone, a note of concern that I had learned to recognize over our years of partnership, that suggested this case would test us in ways beyond the merely intellectual. Our journey to Scotland proved as treacherous as Holmes had predicted. The train to Edinburgh ran hours behind schedule, fighting through drifts that grew deeper with each mile north. From the station windows, I watched the familiar landscapes of the border country disappear beneath a mantle of white that transformed the rolling hills into an alien, forbidding wilderness. In Edinburgh, we were met by Dr. Sinclair herself, a woman of perhaps 40 years, whose intelligent eyes and determined manner immediately commanded respect. Despite the early hour and obvious strain of recent events, she greeted us with the practical efficiency that I had come to associate with the finest academic minds. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I cannot adequately express my relief at your arrival. The situation at Cairngorm Lodge grows more troubling with each passing hour, and I fear that without your expertise, we may find ourselves facing not merely one tragedy, but several." She led us to a waiting carriage, its driver muffled against the biting wind that swept down from Arthur's seat. "I have arranged transport as far as Braemar with Hamish MacLeod here. He knows these roads better than any man living, but even he admits the final approach to the lodge may prove impossible by conventional means." As we settled into the carriage, Dr. Sinclair provided us with the essential details of the situation. The Geological Symposium was organized to examine recent discoveries in the Cairngorm region. Professor McKenna had made some rather extraordinary claims regarding mineral deposits in the area, assertions that had generated considerable controversy within academic circles. What sort of claims? Holmes inquired, his attention immediately sharpening. He believed he had identified previously unknown deposits of rare earth minerals, possibly including significant quantities of platinum and other precious metals. The potential value, if his theories proved correct, would be substantial. Naturally, such claims attracted both supporters and skeptics. The carriage lurched through a particularly deep drift, and I could see the driver fighting to maintain control of his increasingly nervous horses. Through the small window, the landscape had become a monotonous expanse of white, broken only by the dark skeletons of bare trees and the occasional glimpse of stone walls disappearing into the snow. "Who else is present at the lodge?" I asked. Dr. Sinclair consulted a small notebook. "Besides myself and the late Professor McKenna, there are Professor Edmund Hartwell of Cambridge, an expert in mineralogy and McKenna's principal academic rival. Dr. James Thornbury, a younger geologist from Oxford, who had been working closely with McKenna on his research. Miss Catherine Morley, McKenna's most promising doctoral student. Mr. Timothy Ashworth, a final-year undergraduate with particular expertise in mountain surveying. And Angus McBride, the lodge caretaker who has maintained the property for the past 12 years. An interesting collection, Holmes mused. And you say the death occurred at dawn? McBride discovered the body at first light when he went to check on the generator shed. Professor McKenna was found approximately 50 yards from the lodge, near the edge of the cliff that overlooks the valley. His body was partially covered by fresh snow, suggesting he had been there for several hours. Were there any witnesses to his departure from the lodge? Dr. Sinclair's expression grew troubled. That is one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire situation. No one admits to seeing Professor McKenna leave the building, nor can anyone account for why he might have ventured out into such conditions. The storm was at its worst during the night, with winds exceeding 50 miles per hour. The remainder of our journey passed in increasingly difficult conditions. At Braemar, we were forced to abandon the carriage and continue on foot, following MacLeod and 2 local guides equipped with snowshoes and intimate knowledge of the mountain paths. The final 6 miles to Cairngorm Lodge tested even my military-hardened constitution, as we struggled through drifts that reached above our knees and fought against a wind that seemed determined to hurl us from the narrow mountain track. Cairngorm Lodge emerged from the swirling snow like something from a Highland fairy tale, its stone walls and steep-pitched roof offering blessed promise of warmth and shelter. Built in the traditional Highland style with thick granite walls and small, deep-set windows, it presented a reassuringly solid appearance against the savage beauty of the storm-lashed mountains. The door opened before we could knock, revealing a tall, grizzled man whose weathered features spoke of decades spent in the Highland wilderness. This, clearly, was Angus McBride, the caretaker whose discovery of Professor McKenna's body had set our investigation in motion. "Dr. Sinclair, thank the Lord you've returned safely," he said in the lilting accent of the Highlands. "And these must be the gentlemen from London. Come in before you freeze to death on my doorstep." The interior of the lodge was a study in comfortable rusticity, with heavy wooden beams, stone fireplaces, and furnishings that spoke of generations of Highland hospitality. A large common room served as the heart of the building, dominated by a massive fireplace where a cheerful blaze fought back the winter chill. Around this focal point, the other members of our stranded party had gathered, their faces turning toward us with expressions ranging from relief to curiosity to what I could only describe as carefully concealed anxiety. Dr. Sinclair performed the introductions with academic precision. Professor Edmund Hartwell proved to be a distinguished gentleman in his 60s, whose white whiskers and formal manner marked him as a representative of the old school of natural philosophy. His greeting was courteous but reserved, and I noticed that his pale eyes studied Holmes with particular attention. Dr. James Thornbury presented a sharp contrast to his elder colleague. Perhaps 35 years of age, with the lean build and weather-beaten complexion of a man who spent considerable time in the field, he possessed an intensity that seemed barely contained beneath his polite exterior. His handshake was firm, almost aggressive, and his dark eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of recent trauma. Miss Catherine Morley, McKenna's doctoral student, was a young woman of perhaps 25, whose intelligent face and practical dress suggested a serious dedication to her studies. Her greeting was subdued, and I observed that her hands trembled slightly. Whether from cold, shock, or some other cause, I could not immediately determine. The final member of the academic party, Timothy Ashworth, appeared to be the youngest of the group, a fair-haired undergraduate whose boyish features could not entirely disguise a sharp intelligence. He seemed particularly nervous, his gaze darting frequently toward the windows, as if expecting some threat to materialize from the storm outside. "Gentlemen," Dr. Sinclair announced to the assembled group, "may I present Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson? They have come at my request to investigate the circumstances surrounding Professor McKenna's tragic death." The effect of this announcement was immediate and telling. Professor Hartwell's eyebrows rose in apparent surprise, while Dr. Thornbury's expression darkened noticeably. Miss Morley looked relieved, but young Ashworth appeared positively alarmed. "I say," Hartwell interjected, "is such a step really necessary? Surely the poor fellow's death was simply a tragic accident. These Highland storms can be treacherous, and Alistair was never what one might call an experienced mountaineer." "Nevertheless," Holmes replied smoothly, "Dr. Sinclair has requested our assistance, and we are here to provide it. I trust everyone will cooperate fully with our inquiries." McBride stepped forward, his craggy features serious. "Mr. Holmes, if you'd like to examine where the professor was found, I can show you the spot. Though I'm afraid the continuing snowfall may have obscured much of what you might wish to see. Indeed, that would be most helpful. However, first, I should like to examine Professor McKenna's room and belongings, if that might be arranged." The caretaker nodded grimly. "Aye, I've left everything exactly as it was. This way, if you please." As we followed McBride toward the stairs leading to the upper floors, I caught Holmes's eye and recognized the expression I had seen countless times before. The game, as he was fond of saying, was afoot. But as we climbed toward the dead professor's chamber, I could not shake the feeling that this particular game might prove more dangerous than most. The storm continued to rage outside, effectively trapping us in this remote lodge with what I was becoming increasingly certain was a murderer. And somewhere in the gathering darkness of the Highland night, that murderer was watching, waiting, and perhaps even now planning their next move. Professor McKenna's room occupied the northeast corner of the lodge's upper floor, its windows offering what would normally have been a spectacular view of the surrounding peaks. Now, however, the glass panes revealed only the relentless assault of wind and snow that had transformed the Highland landscape into a white wilderness of extraordinary desolation. The chamber itself was spartanly furnished but comfortable, containing a narrow bed, a writing desk positioned beneath the windows, a wardrobe of solid Highland oak, and a washstand with basin and pitcher. What immediately drew my attention, however, were the numerous geological specimens arranged with scientific precision along every available surface. Rocks, minerals, and crystals of various sizes and descriptions covered the desk, the windowsill, and even the top of the washstand, creating a miniature museum of Highland geology. Holmes moved through the room with his characteristic methodical precision, his keen eyes missing nothing as he examined each detail of the professor's final resting place. I watched him pause at the writing desk, where several notebooks lay open beside a portable magnifying glass and various scientific instruments. "Most instructive," he murmured, carefully lifting one of the notebooks. Professor McKenna was clearly a man of systematic habits. "Watson, observe the meticulous nature of his record-keeping." I moved to examine the notebooks over his shoulder. The pages were filled with precise sketches of rock formations, detailed maps of the surrounding terrain, and extensive notes written in a careful hand. Chemical formulas and geological terminology filled the margins, creating a comprehensive record of the professor's research activities. He was particularly interested in the area immediately surrounding this lodge, I observed, noting that several of the sketches depicted familiar landmarks visible from our current position. These drawings show remarkable detail for work conducted in such challenging conditions. "Indeed, and notice this, Watson." Holmes indicated a particular entry dated 3 days previous. Professor McKenna believed he had made a discovery of considerable importance. "The preliminary assays confirm my suspicions," he writes. "The mineral content far exceeds anything previously documented in this region. The implications are staggering. Angus McBride, who had been waiting respectfully near the doorway, cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but the professor was most excited about something he'd found. Spent hours tramping about the mountainside with that young lady, Miss Morley, collecting samples and making his drawings. Did he confide in you regarding the nature of his discovery?" The caretaker shook his head. "Not directly, sir, but I heard him talking to Dr. Thornbury about revolutionary findings and changing everything we thought we knew about Highland geology. He seemed particularly pleased about proving some theory or other wrong." Holmes moved to examine the collection of mineral specimens more closely, using the professor's magnifying glass to study their composition. "Fascinating. Watson, you'll observe that several of these samples display characteristics most unusual for this region. The metallic inclusions suggest the presence of elements not typically associated with highland granite formations." I joined him in examining the specimens, though my medical training had provided little expertise in geological matters. To my untrained eye, they appeared to be ordinary rocks, though several did display an unusual lustrous quality that caught and reflected the lamplight in intriguing ways. "Professor McKenna's satchel," I noted, indicating a leather bag positioned beside the desk. "Shall we examine its contents?" "By all means." Holmes carefully opened the satchel, revealing additional specimens wrapped in cloth, along with various collecting tools and survey equipment. "Most interesting indeed. These samples are quite different from those displayed about the room." He held up several rocks that appeared distinctly different from the others, their coloration and texture suggesting they had been collected from a different geological formation entirely. "McBride," Holmes said, turning to the caretaker, "are you familiar with the terrain in the immediate vicinity of the lodge? Could you identify where these particular specimens might have been collected?" The Highland man examined the rocks with the practiced eye of one who had spent his entire life among these mountains. His weathered brow furrowed in concentration. "That's the curious thing, Mr. Holmes. These don't look like anything I've seen hereabouts. The coloration and texture suggest they came from much deeper deposits, possibly from an old mine working. But I know every inch of this country for miles around, and there's been no mining in this area for generations." Holmes's grey eyes sharpened with interest. "No mining, you say? Are you absolutely certain of that?" "Aye, sir. My grandfather worked these hills before me, and his father before him. There were some small workings way back in the old days, but they were abandoned long before my time. Nothing but sheep and deer have disturbed these mountains for the past century." "Nevertheless," Holmes mused, carefully rewrapping the specimens, "these samples had to come from somewhere. Professor McKenna was clearly excited about something specific, and I suspect these unusual rocks may hold the key to understanding both his discovery and his death." The storm had abated somewhat by the time we ventured outside to examine the location where Professor McKenna's body had been discovered. Though snow continued to fall in occasional flurries, the howling wind had diminished to a manageable level, allowing us to conduct our investigation without the immediate threat of being overwhelmed by the elements. McBride led us around the north side of the lodge to a point where the ground dropped away sharply toward the valley below. The cliff face was not particularly high, perhaps 30 feet at its maximum, but the combination of ice and loose rock would make any fall potentially fatal. "There," the caretaker said, pointing to a depression in the snow approximately 50 yards from the building. "That's where I found poor Professor McKenna. He was lying face down, mostly covered by the fresh snow that had fallen during the night." Holmes immediately began his examination of the area, moving in ever-widening circles around the indicated spot. I watched him work with the systematic thoroughness that had made him the most celebrated consulting detective in London, noting how he studied not merely the ground itself, but also the relationship between the terrain features and the surrounding environment. "Watson, come here and observe this," he called after several minutes of intense scrutiny. "The story these tracks tell is most illuminating." I joined him at a point roughly 20 yards from where the body had been found. In the snow, partially obscured but still visible, were the clear impressions of a man's boots leading from the direction of the lodge toward the cliff edge. "Professor McKenna's final walk," I suggested. "Perhaps, but observe more carefully." Holmes knelt beside the tracks, using his magnifying glass to study the impressions in detail. Notice the depth and spacing of these footprints. They suggest a man walking with deliberate purpose, not someone stumbling about in confusion or distress. I studied the tracks more carefully, beginning to see what had caught Holmes's attention. The footprints were indeed evenly spaced and of consistent depth, indicating a steady, measured pace rather than the erratic pattern one might expect from someone lost or disoriented in a storm. Furthermore, Holmes continued, moving along the line of tracks, observe what happens here. He indicated a point approximately 10 yards from the cliff edge, where the footprints abruptly became less distinct, as if partially obscured or deliberately concealed. The continuing snowfall, I suggested. Possibly. But consider this, Watson. If natural snowfall were responsible for obscuring the tracks, we would expect a gradual deterioration in their clarity, not this sudden transition from distinct impressions to barely visible traces. As Holmes continued his examination, I became aware that we were being observed. Turning toward the lodge, I saw several faces at the windows, watching our investigation with obvious interest. Dr. Thornbury stood at one window, his dark eyes fixed intently on our activities. At another window, Miss Morley peered out with an expression that seemed to combine curiosity with something that might have been apprehension. "Holmes," I said quietly, "we have an audience." He glanced briefly toward the lodge without interrupting his work. "Indeed. Human nature, Watson. The guilty and the innocent alike are drawn to observe the investigation of their circumstances. The challenge lies in distinguishing between mere curiosity and genuine concern." Moving closer to the cliff edge, Holmes discovered additional evidence that further complicated the mystery. "Here, Watson, a second set of tracks, much less distinct but definitely present. Someone else was in this area during the relevant time period. The second set of footprints was indeed much fainter, barely visible in the snow, and appeared to follow a somewhat different path toward the cliff edge. Unlike the first set, these tracks showed evidence of deliberate concealment, as if someone had made an effort to obscure their presence. Two people, I concluded. Professor McKenna and someone else. So it would appear. And notice this curious detail. The second set of tracks approaches from a different direction entirely, suggesting that this person did not leave the lodge by the same route as the professor. Holmes spent nearly an hour examining every detail of the immediate area, mapping the various track patterns, and studying the relationship between the footprints and the terrain features. His investigation was interrupted by the arrival of young Timothy Ashworth, who approached us with obvious nervousness. "I say, Mr. Holmes," the undergraduate began hesitantly, "I hope you don't mind my coming out, but I thought you might be interested to know that Professor McKenna seemed rather agitated yesterday evening. I couldn't help overhearing him arguing with someone in the common room after dinner. Indeed, and could you identify the other party to this argument?" Ashworth's face flushed slightly. "Well, that's the thing, you see." I couldn't make out the exact words, and the other person was speaking quite quietly. But the professor was definitely upset about something. He kept saying things like, "absolutely unacceptable," and "won't stand for this sort of behavior." "Did you observe Professor McKenna's demeanor later that evening?" He seemed preoccupied during our usual evening discussion of the day's findings, kept checking his pocket watch and glancing toward the windows, as if expecting someone or something. Holmes thanked the young man for his information and sent him back to the warmth of the lodge. As we continued our examination of the area, the light began to fade with the early onset of Highland winter darkness. "We should return indoors, Watson. I have seen enough for now to begin forming preliminary conclusions." As we walked back toward the lodge, I could not resist asking, "And what do those conclusions suggest?" Holmes was silent for a moment, his sharp profile etched against the darkening sky. "They suggest, my dear fellow, that Professor McKenna did not die by accident. Furthermore, I believe his death is intimately connected with his recent geological discoveries. Someone in that lodge knows considerably more about the professor's fate than they have yet revealed. One of our fellow guests is a murderer. I fear that is precisely the case, and until this storm breaks and we can summon proper authorities, we find ourselves in the distinctly uncomfortable position of being trapped with that individual." As we approached the lodge, its windows glowing warmly against the gathering darkness, I could not suppress a shiver that had nothing to do with the Highland cold. Somewhere within those cozy walls, a killer waited, no doubt watching and planning while the storm continued to rage outside, ensuring that we remained cut off from any possibility of escape or assistance. The game, as Holmes had said, was indeed afoot, but I was beginning to fear that we might not emerge from Cairngorm Lodge with our lives intact. The evening found us gathered in the lodge's main room, the crackling fire providing both warmth and a focal point for our increasingly tense assembly. Holmes had requested that everyone present themselves for what he termed a general discussion of recent events, and I could sense the undercurrent of anxiety that ran through the group like an electrical charge. Dr. Sinclair attempted to maintain the veneer of academic normalcy, but her usual composure showed signs of strain. Professor Hartwell sat rigidly upright in his chair, his pale eyes darting nervously between Holmes and the other assembled guests. Dr. Thornbury appeared sullen and withdrawn, occasionally glancing toward the windows where the storm continued its relentless assault. Miss Morley fidgeted with her handkerchief, while young Ashworth seemed barely able to contain his agitation. Angus McBride moved quietly about the room, tending to the fire and ensuring that everyone had adequate refreshment, but I noticed that his weathered features bore an expression of deep concern. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes began, his voice carrying easily through the room despite the howling wind outside. "I have spent this afternoon conducting a preliminary examination of the circumstances surrounding Professor McKenna's death. What I have discovered suggests that we are dealing with something considerably more complex than a simple accident." Professor Hartwell cleared his throat nervously. "I must protest, Mr. Holmes. While I certainly appreciate Dr. Sinclair's desire to understand poor Alistair's fate, I fail to see any evidence that would suggest anything other than a tragic mishap. These Highland storms can be treacherous and—" "Professor Hartwell," Holmes interrupted smoothly, "I fear the evidence points quite definitively to foul play. The footprint patterns at the scene, the condition of the deceased's personal effects, and several other factors combine to create a picture that cannot be reconciled with accidental death." Miss Morley leaned forward in her chair, her face pale but determined. "What sort of evidence, Mr. Holmes? Professor McKenna was my mentor and friend. If someone harmed him, I need to know." "Very well. Let us examine the facts systematically." Holmes moved to stand before the fireplace, his tall figure casting long shadows in the flickering light. "First, Professor McKenna's room contains geological specimens that could not have been collected from the immediate vicinity of this lodge. The mineral composition and formation characteristics indicate they originated from a different geological environment entirely." Dr. Thornbury shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Alistair collected samples from various locations during his research trips. Those specimens could have come from anywhere." "Indeed, Dr. Thornbury, but these particular samples were wrapped carefully in the professor's field satchel, suggesting they were recently acquired and considered particularly significant. Furthermore, their unusual composition corresponds precisely to the type of rare earth minerals that Professor McKenna claimed to have discovered in this region." "What are you suggesting?" Dr. Sinclair asked. "I am suggesting that Professor McKenna had indeed made a significant discovery, one that someone else knew about and perhaps coveted. The footprint evidence at the scene indicates that he was not alone when he died. A second person was present, someone who took considerable care to conceal their tracks." The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the continued howling of the wind outside. I watched the faces around me, noting the various expressions of surprise, concern, and what might have been guilt. Young Ashworth suddenly burst out, "I say, this is all getting rather frightening. Are you telling us there's a murderer among us?" "I fear that is precisely what I am telling you, Mr. Ashworth." The effect of Holmes's blunt statement was immediate and dramatic. Miss Morley gasped and pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Professor Hartwell's face went ashen, while Dr. Thornbury's expression darkened with what appeared to be anger. "This is preposterous," Thornbury declared, rising from his chair. "You arrive here with no knowledge of the circumstances, conduct a cursory examination of some footprints in the snow, and immediately conclude that murder has been committed. I find your methods both presumptuous and insulting." Holmes regarded the younger geologist with calm interest. "Dr. Thornbury, your reaction is quite understandable. However, I have not yet finished presenting my findings. Perhaps you would be good enough to resume your seat so that we might continue." Thornbury remained standing for a moment, his jaw set in defiant lines, before reluctantly returning to his chair. "Thank you. Now, as I was saying, the physical evidence strongly suggests that Professor McKenna was not alone at the time of his death. But there is another aspect of this case that I find equally illuminating: the question of motive." Holmes paused, allowing his gaze to move slowly around the assembled group. Professor McKenna's research had generated considerable controversy within academic circles. His claims regarding significant mineral deposits in this region were viewed with skepticism by some of his colleagues. Such professional disagreements can, under certain circumstances, escalate beyond mere scholarly debate. Professor Hartwell's face had grown increasingly pale. "Surely you're not suggesting that academic rivalry could drive someone to murder?" "I am suggesting, Professor Hartwell, that when substantial financial interests become involved, even the most civilized individuals can be driven to desperate measures. Professor McKenna's discovery, if verified, would have been worth a considerable fortune. It might also have validated or destroyed the reputations of various researchers in this field." The next morning brought a temporary lull in the storm, and Holmes immediately announced his intention to conduct a more thorough examination of the surrounding terrain. Despite the treacherous conditions, he insisted that I accompany him on what he termed a crucial investigative expedition. "Watson, I believe Professor McKenna's unusual specimens hold the key to this entire mystery. If we can determine where they were collected, we may be able to understand both his discovery and his death." Armed with the professor's field notes and equipped with snowshoes borrowed from McBride's extensive collection of Highland gear, we set out to explore the immediate vicinity of the lodge. The snow lay deep and pristine, broken only by the wind-sculpted drifts that created an otherworldly landscape of extraordinary beauty and danger. Holmes had studied McKenna's notebooks with characteristic thoroughness, and he led us along a route that followed the professor's documented survey points. We moved slowly through the difficult terrain, with Holmes frequently consulting both the notes and his compass to ensure we maintained the correct bearing. After nearly 2 hours of arduous travel, we reached a point approximately half a mile northeast of the lodge, where the terrain dropped into a sheltered glen surrounded by towering granite cliffs. It was here that Holmes made the discovery that would ultimately solve our case. Watson observed this carefully. He indicated what appeared to be a natural depression in the cliff face, partially concealed by overhanging rocks and drifted snow. Professor McKenna's notes described this exact location, and he was particularly excited about what he found here. Moving closer, I could see that what had initially appeared to be a natural formation was actually the entrance to what had once been a mine shaft. The opening had been carefully concealed, but recent disturbance in the snow and debris suggested that it had been accessed quite recently. "Someone has been using this old working," I observed, noting the clear signs of recent activity. "Indeed. And I suspect that someone is intimately connected with Professor McKenna's death." Holmes carefully examined the entrance, using his magnifying glass to study various marks and disturbances in the surrounding area. The professor discovered this old mine and realized its significance. These workings appear to extend deep into the mountain, following what must be a substantial mineral vein. We spent the next hour exploring the accessible portions of the mine tunnel. Though much of the deeper working was flooded or blocked by cave-ins, enough remained intact to reveal the scope of the operation. Ancient tool marks on the walls and the presence of rusted mining equipment suggested that this had been a significant enterprise at some point in the distant past. Most importantly, the mineral formations visible in the tunnel walls matched exactly the unusual specimens we had found in Professor McKenna's collection. The rare earth elements and metallic inclusions that had puzzled us were clearly present throughout the exposed rock face. "This is it, Watson. This is Professor McKenna's great discovery, not a new deposit, but the rediscovery of an old mine that had been lost or deliberately concealed. The financial implications would indeed be staggering. But who else knew about this place?" Holmes's expression had grown grim. "That, my dear fellow, is the crucial question, and I fear the answer may prove most disturbing when we return to the lodge." Our return to Cairngorm Lodge coincided with the arrival of a fresh storm front that promised to trap us for at least another day. As we removed our outer gear and warmed ourselves by the fire, I could sense a new tension in the atmosphere. The other guests seemed subdued, speaking in hushed tones and casting nervous glances in our direction. Holmes wasted no time in gathering everyone for what he announced would be his final exposition of the case. The group assembled with obvious reluctance, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes began, "this afternoon's investigations have provided the final pieces necessary to solve the mystery of Professor McKenna's death. What we have discovered is a case of murder driven by greed, academic rivalry, and the desperate desire to claim credit for one of the most significant geological discoveries of our time." He moved to stand before the assembled group, his keen eyes studying each face in turn. Professor McKenna had indeed made an extraordinary discovery: the location of an abandoned mine working that contains substantial deposits of rare earth minerals and precious metals. The potential value of this discovery would be measured not in thousands, but in hundreds of thousands of pounds. Miss Morley leaned forward intently. "But how does this relate to his death?" "The professor was not the only person who knew about the mine, Miss Morley. Someone else was aware of its existence and was determined to prevent McKenna from claiming credit for the discovery. That someone lured the professor from the lodge on the night of his death, ostensibly to discuss the implications of his find." Holmes paused, his gaze settling on Dr. Thornbury. "The meeting was arranged by someone Professor McKenna trusted, someone who had legitimate reasons for being interested in his research. They met near the cliff edge where an argument ensued. In the struggle that followed, Professor McKenna fell to his death." "Doctor." Thornbury's face had gone pale, but he remained defiant. "This is pure speculation, Holmes. You have no proof of any of this." "On the contrary, Dr. Thornbury, I have considerable proof. Your reaction to my investigation has been suspicious from the beginning. Your intimate knowledge of Professor McKenna's research, your access to his field notes and specimens, your obvious familiarity with the terrain, all of these factors pointed to your involvement. But the conclusive evidence," Holmes continued, "lies in the mine itself. When Watson and I examined the tunnel this afternoon, we discovered fresh tool marks on the walls and evidence of recent excavation work. Someone has been secretly mining that location for weeks, possibly months, extracting specimens and conducting assays while maintaining the pretense of legitimate academic research." Dr. Thornbury's composure finally cracked. "You can't prove anything. Those old workings have been disturbed by weather, by animals, can't I?" Holmes reached into his coat and produced a small object that glinted in the firelight. "This surveyor's transit bears the initials JT, engraved on the brass fitting. I found it concealed near the mine entrance, dropped no doubt during your hasty departure after killing Professor McKenna. The effect was immediate and devastating. Dr. Thornbury stared at the instrument with obvious recognition, his face cycling through expressions of shock, fear, and finally desperate calculation. "It was an accident," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never intended for him to die." A collective gasp arose from the assembled group. Miss Morley pressed her hand to her mouth in horror, while Professor Hartwell slumped back in his chair as if physically struck. "Tell us what happened," Holmes said quietly, his tone neither accusatory nor sympathetic. Thornbury seemed to collapse in on himself, the fight draining out of him entirely. "I discovered the mine 3 months ago during a preliminary survey of the region. The mineral content was extraordinary, beyond anything I'd ever imagined. I began working the site secretly, planning to document the discovery properly and claim academic credit." He paused, running a trembling hand through his hair. "But McKenna became suspicious. He noticed inconsistencies in my field reports, samples that didn't match the locations I claimed to have surveyed. He began conducting his own investigation." "And eventually discovered your secret," Holmes prompted. 2 weeks ago. He confronted me directly, demanded to know what I was hiding. When I showed him the mine, he became furious, said I had violated every principle of academic integrity, that he would expose me to the university authorities. "Doctor." Sinclair's voice was cold with anger. "So you killed him to protect your reputation?" "No, it wasn't like that." Thornbury's voice rose desperately. "We arranged to meet that night to discuss the situation. I thought I could convince him to share credit for the discovery, to present it as a joint research project. But he refused, said he would reveal everything unless I immediately ceased all activity at the site. And then? Holmes inquired. We argued. The discussion became heated. McKenna threatened to return to Edinburgh immediately and file formal charges against me. In desperation, I grabbed his arm, tried to prevent him from leaving. He pulled away, lost his footing on the icy rocks. Thornbury's voice trailed off into silence. And fell to his death, Holmes concluded, after which you returned to the mine to retrieve your equipment and attempted to conceal all evidence of your activities there. Thornbury nodded miserably. I panicked, tried to make it look like an accident, obscured the tracks as best I could, but the storm was so severe I couldn't be certain what evidence might remain. The room fell into stunned silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the continued howling of the wind outside. The magnitude of Dr. Thornbury's betrayal seemed to settle over the group, like a suffocating blanket. Miss Morley was the first to speak, her voice choked with emotion. Professor McKenna trusted you. He considered you a friend and colleague. How could you do this to him? Thornbury's response was barely audible. The discovery would have made my career. After years of struggling for recognition, of watching lesser minds receive credit for work I should have been doing, I couldn't let it slip away. So you let greed and ambition drive you to murder, Dr. Sinclair said with cold finality. The remainder of our time at Cairngorm Lodge passed in an atmosphere of subdued shock and careful vigilance. With Dr. Thornbury's confession, the immediate mystery had been solved, but the practical matter of ensuring justice remained complicated by our continued isolation. Holmes and I, in consultation with Dr. Sinclair and McBride, arranged for Thornbury to be kept under constant supervision until the storm broke and proper authorities could be summoned. The man himself seemed to have collapsed entirely, offering no resistance and appearing almost relieved that his terrible secret had finally been exposed. On the third morning following his confession, the Highland weather finally began to show signs of improvement. The howling winds diminished to occasional gusts, and gaps appeared in the overcast sky that had pressed down upon us like a grey shroud. By afternoon, McBride announced that travel to the valley might be possible within another day or two. It was during this period of waiting that Holmes made one final discovery that would complete our understanding of the case. While conducting a detailed examination of Professor McKenna's research notes, he uncovered evidence that Dr. Thornbury's crimes extended beyond simple murder. Watson, observe these entries from McKenna's private journal, Holmes said, indicating several pages of closely written text. The professor had documented not only Thornbury's unauthorized mining activities, but also evidence of systematic theft from the university's geological collection. The journal revealed that Professor McKenna had been conducting his own investigation into Thornbury's activities for several weeks prior to his death. He had discovered that valuable specimens had been disappearing from the university's research collection, apparently removed by someone with legitimate access to the storage facilities. Thornbury had been selling stolen specimens to private collectors to finance his secret mining operation, Holmes explained to the assembled group. The profits from these sales provided him with the equipment and supplies necessary to work the site without attracting official attention. This revelation added another dimension of betrayal to an already tragic case. Dr. Thornbury had not only murdered his colleague, but had been systematically looting the institution that had trusted him with important research responsibilities. When the weather finally cleared sufficiently to allow travel, a party of constables and officials from Braemar arrived to take Dr. Thornbury into custody. The young geologist offered no resistance, seeming almost eager to leave the scene of his crimes behind. As we prepared for our own departure from Cairngorm Lodge, I reflected on the strange mixture of natural beauty and human tragedy that had characterized our Highland adventure. The mountains themselves remained magnificent and unchanged, their granite peaks rising majestically against the clearing sky. But for those of us who had witnessed the events of the past week, the landscape would forever be marked by the memory of Professor McKenna's death and the terrible betrayal that had caused it. Our return journey to London provided ample time for reflection on the case and its implications. As our train carried us south through the Scottish borderlands, Holmes and I discussed the various elements that had combined to create such a tragic conclusion. It is instructive, Watson, Holmes observed as we watched the Highland peaks disappear behind us, to consider how quickly academic rivalry can escalate into something far more sinister when substantial financial interests become involved. Dr. Thornbury seemed genuinely convinced that his actions were justified by the magnitude of his discovery. Indeed, the human capacity for self-deception is truly remarkable. Thornbury had persuaded himself that his theft and deception were merely necessary steps toward achieving the recognition he deserved. The murder, of course, was presented as an unfortunate accident resulting from circumstances beyond his control. I studied the familiar landscape rolling past our window, thinking of the friends and colleagues we had left behind at Cairngorm Lodge. What will become of Professor McKenna's research? Will his discoveries receive proper recognition? Dr. Sinclair has assured me that the professor's work will be published posthumously, with full credit given to his memory. The mine site will be properly surveyed and developed according to legitimate academic and commercial protocols. In the end, McKenna's contributions to Highland geology will be far greater than Thornbury's crimes could ever diminish. As evening approached and the lights of London appeared on the horizon, I found myself grateful to be returning to the familiar comforts of Baker Street. The Highland adventure had tested us in ways that went beyond the merely intellectual, forcing us to confront human nature at its most desperate and dangerous. Yet there was satisfaction in knowing that justice had been served, that Professor McKenna's murder had been exposed, and his killer brought to account. In the grand scheme of things, truth had prevailed over deception, and academic integrity had been preserved despite the terrible cost in human life. The hansom cab that carried us from the station to our lodgings passed through streets bustling with the normal activities of London life, vendors calling their wares, pedestrians hurrying about their business, the comfortable chaos of urban civilization. After the isolation and danger of Cairngorm Lodge, these familiar sights and sounds were deeply reassuring. Mrs. Hudson greeted our return with obvious relief and immediately set about preparing a proper English meal to restore us after our Highland ordeal. As we settled into our comfortable chairs before a cheerful coal fire, Holmes reached for his pipe, and I opened the evening papers, both of us grateful to resume the routine of our Baker Street existence. "An interesting case, Watson," Holmes remarked as he filled his pipe with his favorite tobacco, "though I confess I shall be quite content if our next adventure unfolds in rather more temperate surroundings." I smiled, knowing full well that when the next mysterious telegram arrived, as it inevitably would, Holmes would respond with the same enthusiasm and dedication that had characterized his work in the Highland wilderness. For now, however, we were home, safe and warm, with another successful investigation added to our extensive case files. Outside our window, London continued its eternal rhythm of commerce and civilization, while in the distant north, the Highland peaks stood silent and magnificent under their mantle of snow, guardians of secrets both terrible and wonderful, witnesses to the endless human drama of ambition, betrayal, and the eternal struggle between good and evil. The case of the Highland mystery was closed, but its lessons would remain with us always, a reminder that even in the most beautiful and remote corners of our world, human nature continues its eternal dance between nobility and corruption, between the pursuit of knowledge and the darker impulses that drive men to desperate acts. And somewhere in the gathering Highland dusk, the wind continued to blow across the peaks where Professor Alistair McKenna had made his final, tragic discovery.